Hello and welcome to Michael TV. Today joining me is a special friend, Paul Teese. Paul has an amazing story. He's a Catholic priest, he's also a trained psychotherapist, and he has a rich background in the area of recovering from addiction and also integration of sexuality within the priesthood, within the Catholic Church. Paul, you're very welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Michael. It's a great privilege to be with you today. I'm delighted to be here. What would be your first question?
Paul, thank you very much for joining us. And as you know, the spirit of this program or these little videos is to give people hope, to give people insight, and to give people understanding of the different journeys different people have gone on in life. And Paul, you're in a privileged position, a unique position in a way. You're a Catholic priest, and you've got an amazing journey of addiction, of integration of sexuality. I'm sure there's an awful lot that all of us can learn, be it priests, be it seminarians, or even be it just simple lay people such as myself. So, Paul, maybe just to start with, you could give us a little bit of introduction, just who you are, where you've come from, what diocese you're part of, and what you're doing today.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, I'm 65. I was born in North Yorkshire in a small industrial village on the outskirts of Middlesbrough called North Ormsby. I went to school there and eventually went to seminary and was ordained at the age of 25 for the Diocese of Middlesbrough. And then I worked for 10 years in Middlesbrough Diocese until my addiction kicked in. And also I wanted to train as a psychotherapist, so I came to London, where I've worked for the last 30 odd years.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, in that you mentioned your addiction. Could you tell us what addiction that was, and also why did you want to train as a psychotherapist, and how was that integrated, if you like, into the fact that you were already a Catholic priest? And could you explain the story for us, please?
Yes, indeed. My addictions showed themselves in alcoholism, first of all. And in my day, there was quite a culture of heavy drinking in the priesthood, and that certainly I followed. And my addictions, which I think started in childhood, showed themselves in this. And I'm rather grateful today that they did, because they made me face up to problems and difficulties that were there anyway.
Paul, I'm sorry to interrupt you, just to a little question. You said that the addictions, especially the alcohol addiction, started in priesthood, and it was culture of the time. Was it also present in the seminary? Was a lot just kind of overlooked, or what was it like back then?
I don't know that it was particularly overlooked in seminary. There wasn't so much of a culture of drinking there, although we did drink considerably at times. But it was regulated. The training that I received, which of course is a long time ago, and I can only speak for myself, but it didn't really focus on human development. There were odd courses on human development, but they were quite brief and basic, really. I studied psychology at university, so I was aware during my training that there were problems in me, but I didn't face up to them, and I wasn't really helped to do so either.
So would it be fair to say, Paul, that it was a certain idea that if you joined the seminary, well, you were already healed or pretty healed already, and therefore you are there to help broken people, but you not being a broken person yourself?
There was a lot of emphasis on helping others, of course, and that's good. But perhaps to the extent that we didn't focus on our own problems, and particularly around the area of sexuality, it was not particularly examined because, of course, we were going to be celibate, and that offered a solution to any sexual problems. And I'm not sure that that is helpful. In fact, in my case, I know it definitely wasn't. And I think in the case of many of my friends and certainly the colleagues that I have worked with, it was not helpful in the way that we were trained in moral theology rather than in human development as regarding sexuality.
Thank you, Paul. So, Paul, I suppose I'm just imagining now you're a young man, perhaps 25 years old or so. You've just been ordained a priest. And of course, you've taken these vows of obedience, chastity, poverty, or perhaps not poverty in the case of the parish priest, I'm not sure. But in any case, I suppose young and going to conquer the world and going to be the best priest ever and bring lots of souls to Jesus and the church. Could you tell us how, I suppose, that dream began to unravel, the issues around maybe chastity and how it wasn't as easy to live as perhaps you had thought, or perhaps even your moral theology had taught you, and what happened, how stuff began to go wrong, even though you were there with a good heart and genuinely desiring to please God?
I suppose at the time I didn't have the language to understand myself. Um, in my time in seminary, I had rather presumed, having been at boarding school before and all boys education, that I was homosexual. I'd fallen in love with boys of my own age and slightly younger from the age of 14, 15 onwards. I also fell in love with girls. And at university, I did fall in love with a particular girl. And we got very close and had to decide whether we would continue our relationship or not. And I thought in a rather childlike way that I'd made my decision then, and went forward to diaconate, where I promised celibacy as part of the package rather than anything else. I knew I wasn't really called to celibacy. I've always wanted a family. But I accepted it as part of the deal, so to speak. Later on, I came to realise that I fall in love with people just of all sorts. I think I would identify today as pansexual, certainly bisexual.
Paul, thank you. Sorry, just could you just explain to us or anyone out there that might not know, what does pansexual mean? And then please continue on. We're very interested.
Yes, indeed. I only came across the term as a psychotherapist, and in fact, in my second recovery, which is only 5 years ago. So, yes, pansexual is someone who falls in love with people of whatever gender. I just fall in love with people. I do fall in love quite easily, but I then have to make decisions as to what I'm going to do about that. And today I feel I have some freedom to be able to do that. And I am perfectly at home these days with being celibate. I've embraced my celibacy, and I think I find it fruitful in ways that I couldn't even begin to think of even 10 years ago.
So, Paul, is what you're saying is that celibacy and intimacy, they don't have to be enemies?
Certainly not. My celibacy is certainly sexual. I am a sexual being, and I express my sexuality in celibate ways. And I'm delighted to be able to do that. It gives me affirmation physically, personally, and emotionally. And I think also develops me spiritually.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, could you tell us the journey that you've gone on? I know from speaking to you before that now you say that you live a fruitful, life-giving celibacy, but earlier in your priesthood it was more of a martyrdom, and that it brought you a lot of misery, really, and that instead of maybe bringing the joy and the hope to people, you actually were walking around with a frown. Could you maybe walk us on that journey, maybe for the benefit of any priests or any other celibate people out there that are struggling with the whole concept of celibacy and also being happy? Could you share with us a little bit of your journey and how you've come to this place of fruitful celibacy?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can help anyone, but I'm certainly willing to share my experience. When I was ordained, as I say, I was ordained deacon when I was 23 and promised celibacy genuinely, but didn't quite understand the implications. Not quite, I didn't understand the implications. I had the opportunity of a physical relationship with a girl and with the boys, and I had chosen not to enter those relationships. And I thought that this was what I was called to do, because I felt the calling to be a priest, and the opportunity to be a married priest wasn't there at the time. So I continued and went ahead. And then in my first 5 years of priesthood, I met a woman who offered me again a very warm and physical relationship. It started as a deep friendship, and I was supposed to be only there 2 years because I was supposed to be going on for further studies. When my bishop decided that I wasn't going to be sent on for further studies, I then was stuck in the parish, and I had hoped that the boundary of me moving on would prevent the relationship developing any further. It did develop further. It was a mistake. Both of us were fragile human beings, and we made mistakes. She's a lovely person. I don't know her anymore. I'm not in contact with her anymore. But she was very kind to me and very good. And through that mistake, I learned a lot about myself. And that was the first time that I'd really understood that in order to learn, I do need to make mistakes.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, that's very vulnerable, and I'm sure there are lots of people out there, and not just priests. I'm sure there are lots of married men and people in relationships of all sorts that, even with the best intentions to stay loyal to their husband or wife or partner or whatever, end up similar situation, making a mistake. So thank you, Paul. Paul, what was it like, for us to imagine? What was it like being a priest, knowing that you had made those vows of chastity, knowing that in heart you are a good man, that you're following God as best you can, and yet living with that sense perhaps in your heart of failure, of breaking these vows, and perhaps the shame and even condemnation?
It was a great struggle, and to know that I'd broken my solemn promise to remain celibate was a great burden to me. I confessed it on many occasions, but I wasn't truly honest with myself. I tried to break off the relationship on, I think, 6 or 7 occasions. It continued for over 5 years, and my friend was very vulnerable herself, and psychologically we were codependent is perhaps the correct term. But eventually we did break the relationship. She was not particularly happy about it, and that was when my drinking had exacerbated throughout the relationship because of my guilt. And by then it had become problematic, though not perhaps fully addictive at that point, although the patterns were there. I was a binge drinker and it was beginning to disrupt my life, but I was sent into treatment before it really got too bad at that point. It got much worse later on, I'm afraid. But yes.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, we can already see and feel the immense pain, and I know there are some people out there that expect, I guess, priests at times to be perfect, or forget that priests or young men who went to the seminary also come from broken backgrounds and also come from difficult, maybe family backgrounds and stuff. And could you maybe give us a little bit of insight into your background? And you went on this journey of addiction recovery, and praise God, you're still here with us today. And that, of course, unraveled for you a lot of the patterns and problems that were behind it all. And just in the light of helping people to understand and have more mercy on priests in general, and also more mercy even on themselves, could you maybe explain to us a little bit?
Yes, I was born into a very religious family. My mother was a Protestant and my father was a Catholic. My father was lapsed, but my mother had promised to bring us up Catholics in order to marry my father. And so I was brought up a Catholic by my mother, who was honouring her promise. I always felt an outsider because in our village we were divided very much between Protestants and Catholics, and most of my family were Protestants, especially my cousin, who's 10 months younger than me and an Anglican minister now. She was my closest friend throughout my life, really, and I never felt I quite belonged anywhere because I was neither Catholic nor Protestant. I went to both churches. And my mother also had quite a tragic life, my mother and father, in that my sister Susan died when I was 6 months old at the age of 2.5. She was the darling of their lives, and it was a great tragedy. It was never spoken of, and I didn't find out that I'd had a sister until I was over 4. And even then, her name was never mentioned in the house. It was too much to bear. Then my mother had a series of miscarriages, of which I didn't know any, except when I was 13. There was one. Other than that, there were 5 miscarriages altogether, all late, stillbirths really. And I didn't find about them until I was trained as a psychotherapist and actually asked my mother because I knew there were gaps in my childhood. My mother, of course, went into depression, my father into rages. Perfectly understandable with such tragedies. but because it wasn't spoken about, I didn't have any way of dealing with it.
Paul, thank you for that, and I'm sure many of us can relate in the sense of certain issues being brushed under the carpet, such as alcoholism, or not in your case violence, but other things. I suppose it's a very, what you'd say, human thing to do. We all know the concept of keeping up appearances. Paul, it seemed like that the same kind of attitude that your parents had of brushing things away is kind of what happened to you when you went into the seminary as well. Was the seminary an open place or a closed place in terms of integration and working through maybe some of those problems?
There was lots of things not spoken about in the seminary, including some acting out in predatory behaviour on the part of some of the lecturers there. They were subsequently prosecuted, and this just wasn't spoken about at the time. It was brushed under the carpet, or it was played down. We didn't, society didn't understand it fully. We've really only uncovered that recently. And the church is always a bit slower than society in taking on these things. I think we were painfully slow in this case. And there was some damage inflicted in my time in seminary. We couldn't talk about our own relationships very easily to one another. Never mind it being facilitated, it wasn't. It was not encouraged, really. It was more a living by external rules than an internal integration of personality.
So, Paul, thank you for that, Paul, and for that insight. So, what I'm gathering is that your training as a psychotherapist later in life actually gave you a greater insight in maybe vocabulary, a language, even words perhaps to bring to your prayer life and to bring to God. And it actually helped you not only integrate your sexuality, but also integrate your spirituality, your priesthood, and bring you to this place of what you call now fruitful celibacy.
Indeed, I would say that, in fact, it's my addiction that has brought me to this position, in that my concept of God was that, yes, God was all merciful and caring, except for me. It wasn't really that I didn't have a personal caring God. I preached and behaved as though God loved everyone else and cared for them, but I was never quite convinced of it for me personally. Possibly because of childhood traumas and my relationship with my own father, of course, who beat me. He fell into rages. So it was difficult for me, and it was only when I did my third step in a 12-step fellowship, and we have to offer our lives to the care of a God of our understanding. And I didn't really believe that God cared for me. And it was only through the fellowship and the love and care that I experienced there that I began to understand that I do have a personal Saviour who loves me and cares for me, and it has transformed my spirituality. I tried to understand this intellectually and spiritually for many, many years, but it was only when it came together with the emotional experience of as unconditional love as human beings can offer, which I discovered in the fellowship rather than in the church, I'm afraid, that I could integrate this into my own personality. This is only my own story. I'm not saying that the church is without people like this, because there are people in the church who have loved me as unconditionally as human beings can.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. Paul, I'm sure for some people out there listening, it's quite a shocking thing almost to hear that there you are, you're a priest, you've been a priest for many years, speaking about the love of God, the love of Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus, and while you believe it for others, in your heart, you don't quite or have never experienced it or doubted for yourself. And at some level, I suppose a lot of us can relate to that. And at another level, many of us expect, well, priests are sort of perfect human beings, and that while that's okay for a layperson, surely not for a priest. Paul, what would you say to other priests or seminarians or pastors even out there that maybe today are experiencing the same thing and are ashamed or too afraid to share this or to say this to anybody in case they will get perhaps fired or whatnot.
Yeah. Shame held me back for a long time. In fact, I would say that shame was my biggest problem, in that I never liked myself. And it's only in latter years that through the 12 step fellowship that I have learned to like myself. And I see myself now with a fair measure of amusement. I'm a person who makes mistakes. I'm not a very good priest, I know that. I always find it quite a part of God's sense of humour that He chose me to be a priest, because humanly there's no reason why I should be a priest. I really shouldn't. But for some reason, the church called me to be a priest, and I end up being one. And I enjoy it because I suppose I've given up striving after the ideal. I try to live an ideal today, but I'm a work in progress, and our fellowship talks about progress, not perfection. The perfection I aim for is, as in the gospel, be ye perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, fit for the job, and I think I am fit for the job more or less now. And I get better and better at it. I get a better fit between me and my people. And that's the teleos, the perfection that I nowadays rejoice in, that God fits me for the purpose that He's called me to. And if I'm open to that, then I'm okay. It's a good enough fit to work, like a screwdriver fitting the screw. You know, if the screw turns, then it's good enough. And I feel that that's what I'm like as a priest. I used to aim for moral perfection, spiritual perfection. Now it's just, well, God makes me as perfect as He needs me to be to do the job. And if I'm open to that, then the rest will come. And my prayer has changed tremendously. Nowadays, my meditation is very silent, just opening myself to the will of God. My prayer is basically just, Thy will be done. I don't know what it is most of the time. With retrospect, I look back and think, oh yeah, that's what God meant. I don't know most of the time in the present moment. I just have to be open.
Well, thank you, Paul. So, Paul, is it what you're saying is that to other priests out there, that in some ways take off the burden of trying to be perfect, take off the burden of maybe thinking that you have to be perfect, or if you're not perfect, you've let the church down, and to be vulnerable?
I think so. I mean, I used to think that it was my strengths that would make me a good priest, but it's actually my weaknesses. It's my mistakes that people like, rather than when I can be a very efficient and very uncaring parish priest. I can get things right and hurt people. Whereas if I hurt people, I hope I can acknowledge that I've made a mistake, or that perhaps the hurt was something that they needed to experience. And sometimes we do need to be challenged by the Word of God, and that can hurt us. But when it's that sort of hurt, that's really growing. That's when we do grow spiritually and personally.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, Paul. I suppose what I'm hearing is that there's a great power in fellowship and vulnerability, in working through our brokenness with God in the eyes of God. And Paul, you mentioned just a little bit earlier as we were talking that you received a lot of that healing and a lot of that insight through the AA, the fellowship, and not necessarily, or not perhaps in a church organization. And Paul, I suppose I can imagine that there are a lot of people out there, and perhaps there are a lot of priests out there that don't know where or how to reach out for help. They're perhaps afraid to be vulnerable because if something is shared in the wrong context or to the wrong people. So, Paul, what would you say perhaps to them?
I think it's important to find a place where we can feel vulnerable and know that that will be respected. I found it in 12 step fellowships. I spend most of my time these days in NA. And I find that that's where I can be vulnerable, and people accept me as I am. But I can then bring that experience into my life in the church. And I hope that in the parishes that I work in, I can be vulnerable. I risk, yes, and sometimes people don't like it, and I'm sorry about that, but I can be myself more now in my parishes, and I hope I've found other places, other associations within the church where my vulnerability is respected. I have a community of sisters I'm very close to, and some people who work in various aspects of the church where I feel I can share most things.
Well, thank you, Paul. And I know personally, I've benefited from your vulnerability, your insights, your prayers, and many times I come to you for confession as well. So I can speak firsthand of the power of the vulnerability and just talking to someone who understands with the heart. Paul, if you could travel back 40 years, so you're 65 now, so if you could travel back maybe even 45 years and place yourself at 20 years old or so, and there you are, but you're in the seminary. Suppose now you were made rector, or you were in charge of this seminary and you're in charge of the formation. What maybe insights, or what would you change, or how could you perhaps, how could some of the pitfalls have been avoided?
Oh gosh, I'm not very good at this sort of thing. I would like to think that seminaries today have a better structured course of human development, that everything is based on human development and the development of the whole person spiritually, emotionally, and sexually. And that these issues are discussed openly and life affirming. I'm not sure that does happen. I don't quite know how that would work. I think some of the insights of 12-step fellowships could be used greatly in our training, as I use them in my personal life. But that is risky, and as an organisation, the church is a little bit stuck because, of course, organisations minimise risk, and that's natural. And I'm not, I don't feel that I would have any great. The only input I would offer is to talk about development of the whole person. How that's brought about, I'm not entirely sure.
Well,
I'm
thank
not
you.
sure seminaries are the right places. I would think small groups would be much better. But I'm sorry.
Well, thank you, Paul. Yes, I find that very helpful. I'm sure people out there will find it helpful too. Paul, now 65, and obviously with many years' experience in the church, and also, of course, meeting people outside or in the bigger church, the wider church, so to speak, to the NA fellowships, the AA fellowships, etc. Paul, what do you think us in the church can bring to these groups, and what can these groups bring to us? And how can perhaps we all grow into one single church where there is more openness, more vulnerability, at the same time more prayer? How as Catholics can we bring the church maybe more alive, more human, so to speak?
I think this is something I could speak on with more authority, because I think I have some vision for parish life, which could probably reflect into training, in that I would like to see the parish develop in a way that takes, that respects the authority of the parish grouping, and that we hold one another to loving account in our Christian life. This would mean that a parish council wouldn't just be a decision-making body, it would be a body that discerned the will of God for this Christian community and took appropriate decisions. And priests and ministers generally, and I'd like to see a lot of ministry that's not just priestly in parishes. There's lots of people who are perfectly capable of doing lots of things in our parishes, and I'd like to see that in the decision-making process, their views are taken into account and the views of every ordinary parishioner, but that we don't get locked into the power bases of society where we have a very adversarial system and society. Whereas I think if we can move by consensus, and councils of the church have always decided things by consensus. We have, I think, a very exciting synod happening in Germany, which I hope we will embrace in this country as well. And the synodic process, I think, can be replicated in parish life as well. And this would revolutionise the parish. It could then revolutionise our training, because we could train people in our parish communities and then hand them on for academic formation to universities or university colleges or whatever, but that the spiritual and personal development would be done in parish-based communities.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, that sounds prophetic almost and exciting. Paul, you mentioned a little bit about the Synod in Germany, and of course as well you're aware of my own testimony, my own personal story and my own life journey of integration of sexuality, spirituality, the whole area of homosexuality and the difficulties being Catholic and gay. Paul, what insights have you to offer in this area, and from perhaps your own personal experience or even meeting other people? And where do you think we're at in today's Catholic Church? And how do you think we can improve, and in this improving, bring people closer to God, but also closer to their true selves and closer to one another?
I think this process that the German bishops have embarked upon is absolutely crucial. And I think we need to replicate that, not only in this country, but in our own parishes. It seems to me, and this is my personal opinion, that there is a great gap between what seems to be the official teaching of the Church, though I think theologians would have some discussion about that, and general practice. For example, the birth rate in Italy and in this country is roughly the same as any secular society. So therefore, one presumes that married people are practicing contraception, artificial contraception, which, according to certain opinions, is condemned by the Church. If we have this gap, then I think we need to address it. I would see theology as reflecting the lived spiritual experience of the people of God. And if their lived spiritual experience is not in accordance with our theology, then our theology needs to change. And I think that's the position we are in. My own personal life give testimony to this, but a lot of the confessions that I hear, a lot of the people I meet, are moral theology as far as sexuality is concerned is out of sync with the lived spiritual experience of our good, ordinary people. And this needs to be addressed, and we're not really addressing it.
Paul, thank you for that. Paul, I'm sure some people out there may hear that and sort of think that you're liberal and you're advocating everything. Other people out there might hear that and think the opposite, that you're still old-fashioned priest or something. How do we get, if you like, the middle ground? How do we bring people closer to God? Say, for example, the two groups of people I have in mind would be, one maybe being why are women who are using contraception but are good people, love God, and yet fall short, if you like, of this right or wrongly, this moralistic perfection. Another group of people would be the gay community, and similarly, when they see the teaching of the Church, they may feel too that it's impossible. So, Paul, how do you see this? Where do you see the Church can meet people where they're at and yet bring people forward?
I think it's not just middle ground, Michael. I think this goes right to the heart of Christianity. It's who we see ourselves as human beings. And human beings are sexual. And it's our understanding of sexuality talks about who we are. And we are redeemed human beings. This is, I think, the bedrock of all our belief. And when it comes to sexual morality, we need to take this very seriously. And it involves not just the gay community, where a lot of these issues have come to the fore, and thank goodness for the courage of the gay community bringing these things to the attention of the wider audience. but it does go right the way across the board. If we see sexuality as God-given and good, and that we can express our sexuality in really healthy ways and become more and more fully human and therefore fully divine, then it changes the way we look at it. I think for some time the church has concentrated on the negative aspects of sexuality and looked at the rules rather than looking at people's lived experience. And if we look for love and then say, how do we express this theologically, then we are onto something. But for the church recently, love has not been the solution. Love has been the problem. When we've found gay couples, for example, who are living a loving life and they're committed to one another, we have difficulties because our theology doesn't cover that at the moment. I think it can. And I think that's exciting.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, you mentioned there healthy and unhealthy ways of expressing sexuality. And I know if I spoke to you 10, 15 years ago, as soon as I would have heard the word sexuality, I would have equated with sex. And I think a lot of people do that, Paul. So as soon as they hear of expression of sexuality, they think of the bedroom, they think of the last saucy film they saw, or they think of the last episode of some TV show they saw. Paul, as a priest, and because of your own journey and your own vulnerability, you're more familiar than most with people sharing and being intimate and telling you the nitty-gritty details of their lives. Could you kind of explain to us in a more insightful way what it means and healthier versions of exploring and sharing sexuality and what sexuality is in a broader sense of just the genitalia?
Yes, although, like many people, I would automatically as well think of sexuality as the act of sex. But it's much wider than that, I think. And you brought up intimacy, Michael, and I think it's inevitably connected with intimacy. And we express intimacy in a variety of ways: psychological intimacy, physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, even spiritual intimacy. And for me, that's where it does all come together. After all, the Gospels themselves have lots of images of intimacy between Jesus and his disciples. We have, of course, the beloved disciple reclining on Jesus's breast during the Last Supper, obvious intimacy. We have, just recently at the Feast of Pentecost, Jesus breathing on his disciples. And we've only to think of the breath of a loved one against our cheek. This is a very intimate moment. Jesus breathes on his disciples. They breathe in the Holy Spirit in the breath of Jesus. And so often we reinterpret these images of intimacy. The exchange between Jesus and Simon Peter in St. John's Gospel. Do you love me, Simon Peter? A question of amazing vulnerability. Just think of the times that you have asked anyone, do you love me? Very few times have I ever asked anyone, do they love me? And even to say that I love someone is an incredibly vulnerable moment. Jesus asks this of Simon Peter, do you love me? Think how vulnerable Jesus makes himself and how honest Peter is when he says, I love you with friendship love. Jesus asks him, do you love me with agape, unconditional love? And Peter says, well, I love you with friendship love. And he keeps on friendship love. And Jesus eventually changes his question. Do you love me with friendship love? He accepts that we are human beings who friendship love is about as good as we can get. And I think if we remember that, then we have a very different attitude. We're not then looking for rule-bound love. We're looking for love that expresses as best we can the ideal. And that's in relationship. It is only in relationship that we discover truth. And if we're lucky, the truth can possess us, but we never possess the truth. It's always beyond us. And that's true in sexual morality as well as any other developing virtue. we are on the way. And if we can accept that, it brings in the ideal and spurs us forward. I think that because the church has simply stuck to prohibitions, we have not entered the debate, and so we've lost it by default. There's lots of insights that we can offer to the world about true expression of intimacy and sexuality that we are not expressing because we don't enter into the debate. We just say it's wrong. So, for example, I do think the church has made a mistake in saying that homosexuality is objectively disordered. It just cuts out the debate. And if sexuality is God-given, then homosexuality is God-given. It's a gift. Let's celebrate it. Let's work out how best to celebrate it. That's the challenge the church can helpfully offer. And because we simply close down the debate, we don't help anyone, and we certainly don't help ourselves. We have to learn from people's experience. The church doesn't possess the truth, can't. It can be a container for the truth, but the truth will always be bigger than us, and that's what we've got to accept. And in humility, I think the church needs to learn humility.
Paul, if I
And the
could,
church.
Paul, sorry to interrupt you because I'm fascinated with what you're saying, and I'm sure many of the viewers will be as well. Paul, could you explain to us or give us an insight, really? Homosexuality, for example, or even the wider LGBT spectrum, it's not something new. It's not something that suddenly has appeared. St. Paul speaks about it, even though he may not be the best person to bring up right now. But why is it, Paul, that after 2,000 years, we have immense amount of development and books to be read on the family, and many even Catholic saints on the family? How come in the whole LGBT area, the church seems to have avoided it, almost like a family who was looked after splendidly 4 of the 5 kids, but just has left this one kid? How come the church at times seems to have adopted this same attitude of developing advanced theology in some areas, splendid theology, wonderful stuff, and yet in other areas, this being one and probably not the only one, just brushing it aside, and as a result, brushing the people involved, such as me and many others, almost aside?
Thank you, Michael. I'm not sure that it's only ignored the LGBT community of which I'm a member, but it's avoided the whole spectrum of sexuality. And to talk about sexuality as a spectrum is something new for the church, although not perhaps for society as a whole, although there's still pockets that don't seem to think that there is a spectrum of sexuality and it's all to be understood. We perhaps need to look more about sexuality and listen to people's experience. People who experience sexuality as holy. And I can speak from my own personal experience that I know when I express my sexuality well, there is a holiness there. There's a sanctity about it. And we don't, in a medieval church, they did talk about the sacramentality of the sexual act. And we've always notionally held on to this, but we need to explore it much more fully, I think, today. I think the exciting thing for the church is that dialogue is possible, and it is exciting. By entering into dialogue with modern science and with people's experience, then we can learn new ways forward. And the church is always developing. Our theology is always changing, always developing, seeing more things, understanding things slightly better, always knowing that it's going to be beyond us, but using other people's gifts. And I think this is particularly true with my experience of entering into dialogue with people in the LGBT community. I sometimes go to 12-step fellowship meetings that are LGBT organised, and talking with people there and talking with people in the Catholic LGBT community has really helped me understand not only myself and them, but also looking at the theology of the church. And for example, every species has homosexual behaviour. Now, science tells us this. If we understand that, then our understanding of natural law, which the church seems to rely perhaps too much on, has to change. Because if homosexual behaviour exists in animal species, then presumably it is willed by God because they act out of their nature. We can't talk about it being unnatural as it used to be. And so we have to reassess our understanding. And a lot of our theology is based on rather old-fashioned visions of humanity and human nature. And listening to biological studies, medical studies, and anthropological studies, then the church can refine its understanding. And this is of benefit to all of us, I think. It seems to me that this is the great opportunity that we've got, and that I would like to be part of personally, that we can explore together what God is saying to all of us. Because God doesn't just speak through the church, he speaks in every human heart. And we need to be open to listen to those people's experience. And I think we have a tremendous number of people, particularly in the LGBT community, who have been damaged by the church and find it difficult to enter into dialogue. They don't feel that they're listened to. And I would like to feel that some of us can be part of that healing process where we do all feel listened to and valued for what our own experience has led us to.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, I'm greatly moved by what you're saying, and also what I feel in my heart is, what is it like for you, who on one hand you're a priest, and say for a member of the LGBT community who has been damaged by the church, they might even be afraid to talk to you, not knowing, of course, that you too are a member of the LGBT community. Paul, what is it like to be part of this organisation, which unfortunately, through errors and through lack of mercy and lack of understanding, has damaged and broken a lot of people? And there's a massive rate, for example, of depression, anxiety, suicide in the LGBT community. Much of that which has come from, the sources have often come from very religious, extreme backgrounds, sometimes members being kicked out of home by Catholic or Christian families because of their sexual orientation. And how do you feel, Paul, at times when you come across these broken people, you see their tears, you hear their cries, and what would you like to say to the maybe senior members of the church in terms of their brokenness, their pain, and these hearts that are screaming also for the love of God?
I think I'd like to offer some of my own experience. I did not experience as much as many people have, but I did not have the language to express my own understanding of my sexuality until about 8 years ago. I identified as bisexual 20 years ago, and I've been quite happy with that. But it didn't quite express the whole of my sexuality. And it was only when I was offered the concept of pansexuality by a friend that that clicked.
And pansexuality, Paul, just to remind anyone listening, pansexuality being attracted to people in general.
Yes.
Just a click, as you would say, or a deep end. Yes.
I fall in love with people. And that suddenly made sense of me. And I think that can be offered to other people in their own ways. But you were talking about depression, and I was depressed because I couldn't express who I really was. And I think that that does contribute to a lot of people's depression. As you know, I work as a psychotherapist and I work a lot with depression. And the church has a real opportunity here, I think, to accompany people on their journey. Our present Pope talks about this a lot, and I think that is our vocation, not to come with ready-made answers, but simply to say, I will be with you in the questions. I don't have answers. Your answer will be unique to you, but I want to be with you on that journey. I want to offer you what I can in love and acceptance on that journey. And it seems to me that that's something that is being offered in other places more obviously than in the church at the moment.
Paul, what you're saying sounds wonderful, and I suppose coming from a place or anyone of brokenness, we all need that space, like learning a foreign language. We all need that space to go out into the open air and put it into practice and see how we get on, kind of a feedback loop, so to speak. And obviously, we're all aiming and striving towards perfection, but like learning to cycle a bike, we do our best and yet we can fall off. Paul, more specific question just in relation to priests. In your own experience, do you feel or do you know of, are there many priests that are struggling, even now, struggling silently in this whole area of integration of sexuality, spirituality, chastity, and are maybe today where you were some years back?
I think many are struggling. I still struggle myself. I'm never quite comfortable with saying that where I was years back because I'm still in a very vulnerable position myself. It's a day by day experience of recovery, which is recovery in every area of my life, including sexuality. And I think it's very sad that we don't have any, or there don't seem to be, to me, many places where we as priests can discuss our sexuality and our growth as sexual beings, because of fear, really. And I do think that we have to talk a little bit more openly. I think that's why I agreed to this interview, Michael, because I do feel that I feel this strongly and I've got to put my money where my mouth is. So that's what I'm doing today, sharing with you something of my own vulnerability and the fact that I have not always lived my celibacy as I would want to. I have not lived up to my promises, and it was only quite recently when I fell in love with a guy and he fell in love with me, and I learned so much more that has allowed me to bring my celibacy into a much more fruitful phase, I think. And I don't know about other priests, but I do know from people who come to me that there are many priests struggling with these areas. And we don't talk generally about it. Most of us have some confidants that we can talk a little bit about it, but a very close friend of mine just recently told me that the relief he felt at being able to say that he was gay. He is my age, and yeah, there are lots, I think, in whether gay or straight, we don't talk about our sexuality. But we don't in the church with married people. So, it's, yeah, we've a long way to go.
Well, thank you, Paul, for those insights. Especially, Paul, thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for your honesty. I know from talking to you on previous occasions that you've been through in your life so many ups and downs, and you've been like a cat with 9 lives. But I'm thankful to Jesus, thankful to God that you're still here, you're still with us, you're still a priest, and you're doing more now, I think, through your vulnerability, through your prayer, than perhaps you may have ever thought you could do. And I pray, Paul, that what you've been through and what you continue to go through, of course, can be a source of inspiration to other people, but also can be a source of learning, a source of reflection for the church, and also perhaps for priests or theologians or people out there struggling to bring these areas together, so sexuality, spirituality, theology, etc., that it'd be an inspiration to help integrate all that. So, Paul, thank you very, very much for being with us today. Thank God for bringing you this far. Thank you for all your help you've given to me personally. And I'm going to finish by maybe asking you, I haven't told you in advance, so this is going to be off the cuff. Could you just say a short prayer? I know you love meditation. A short little prayer with anyone listening today that might be suffering, might be struggling, might be afraid, might be wondering.